Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 390 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about St. Albert the Great and magic. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around for the end of the episode, as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode on the second part of Jimmy's interview with Alexander Eth of the Glitch Bottle podcast on grimoires and the occult. But first, for hundreds of years, people have been interested in the intersection between science and magic. One of these individuals was Albertus Magnus, or St. Albert the Great. He's a saint and a doctor of the church. He wrote about theology, philosophy, science, and magic. So what did he have to say? What were his views on science and magic? And how should we regard him today? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So Jimmy, tell us what we're going to be doing today.
Well, first of all, I want to mention a previous episode that we did on magic, science, religion, and psychic phenomena, which was episode 79. So you can check that episode out for the basic distinctions of what we're talking about. But today, we're going to be listening to a presentation on St. Albert the Great by Dr. Justin Sledge. Listeners of Mysterious World will recognize him from episodes 218 and 219, where I interviewed him about the Kabbalah. And I also plan to have him back on other topics in the future. Today's talk originally came out in September on Justin's Esoterica channel. And in keeping with that, the talk focuses on the mysterious aspect of, the magical side of St. Albert's work. I saw it when it came out and it was really good. And I'd already been thinking about doing an episode on St. Albert. And I realized that I could, rebuild a similar episode from the ground up, or I could interview Justin and have him basically repeat everything he'd said, or I could ask his permission to run his episode here on Mysterious World. So I spoke with him, and he very kindly gave his permission to let me do that. And except for a brief introduction and conclusion, that's what we're going to be doing today.
What do we need to know about Albert the Great before we watch Dr. Sledge's presentation?
Well, if you read about him, you'll see that he's referred to both as St. Albert the Great and as Albertus Magnus, which is Albert the Great in Latin. He was born somewhere around the year 1200, and he died in the year 1280. During his life, he joined the newly formed Dominican order, and he became known as a theologian and a philosopher. He was also a teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he outlived his famous pupil. St. Thomas died in 1274 on his way to the Council of Lyon, and according to the Catholic Encyclopedia,
the announcement of the death of St. Thomas at Passa Nuova, as he was proceeding to the council, was a heavy blow to Albert, and he declared that the light of the Church had been extinguished. It was but natural that he should have grown to love his distinguished saintly pupil, and it is said that, ever afterwards, he could not restrain his tears whenever the name of St. Thomas was mentioned. Something of his old vigor and spirit returned in 1277, when it was announced that Stephen Timpier and others wished to condemn the writings of St. Thomas on the plea that they were too favorable to the unbelieving philosophers like Aristotle, and he journeyed to Paris to defend the memory of his disciple.
St. Albert was also appointed as bishop of Regensburg in 1260, and he had a reputation for taking his parish visitation duties in his diocese seriously. He was given the nickname Episcopus cum botis, which literally means the bishop with boots, but which has been translated more freely as Boots the Bishop. The reason being that as a Dominican, he wasn't supposed to ride horses the way a great lord would, so he walked everywhere he went. He didn't serve as bishop long, though. In 1263, he got permission from the Pope to retire from those duties, so he only functioned as a bishop for 3 years. His work included a great deal of writing, and St. Albert wrote amazingly well on an amazing number of subjects, which is what earned Albert the nickname of Magnus, or the Great. He also earned other nicknames. Back in the Middle Ages, they'd give you nicknames that reflected the quality of your philosophical work. These are called scholastic accolades, like St. Thomas Aquinas was known as the Doctor Angelicus, or Angelic Doctor, meaning the angelic teacher, so he taught like an angel. Or Blessed John Duns Scotus, who is known as the Doctor Subtilis, or the Subtle Doctor, because of the subtlety of his thought. And Albert the Great was known as the Doctor Universalis, or the Universal Doctor, because his scope was universal. He basically wrote on everything. In fact, it's been said that Albert the Great was the last person who knew everything it was possible to know before the mass of human learning grew so great that no one person could know it all. Here's how Wikipedia describes the scope of his thought.
Albert's writings, collected in 1899, went to 38 volumes. These displayed his prolific habits and encyclopedic knowledge of topics such as logic, theology, botany, geography, astronomy, astrology, mineralogy, alchemy, zoology, physiology, phrenology, justice, law, friendship, and love. He digested, interpreted, and systemized the whole of Aristotle's works, gleaned from the Latin translations and notes of the Arabian commentators, in accordance with church doctrine. Most modern knowledge of Aristotle was preserved and presented by Albert. His principal theological works are a commentary in 3 volumes on the Books of the Sentences of Peter Lombard and a Summa Theologiae in 2 volumes. The latter is in substance a more didactic repetition of the former. Albert's activity, however, was more philosophical than theological. The philosophical works, occupying the first 6 and the last of the 21 volumes, are generally divided according to the Aristotelian scheme of the sciences, and consist of interpretations and condensations of Aristotle's relative works, with supplementary discussions upon contemporary topics, and occasional divergences from the opinions of the master. Albert believed that Aristotle's approach to natural philosophy did not pose any obstacle to the development of a Christian philosophical view of the natural order. Albert's knowledge of natural science was considerable, and for the age, remarkably accurate. His industry in every department was great. Not only did he produce commentaries and paraphrases of the entire Aristotelian corpus, including his scientific works, but Albert also added to and improved upon them. His books on topics like botany, zoology, and minerals included information from ancient sources, but also results of his own empirical investigations. These investigations pushed several of the special sciences forward, beyond the reliance on classical texts. In the case of embryology, for example, it has been claimed that little of value was written after Aristotle until Albert, who managed to identify organs within eggs. Furthermore, Albert also effectively invented entire special sciences where Aristotle has not covered a topic. For example, prior to Albert, there was no systematic study of minerals. For the breadth of these achievements, he was bestowed the name Doctor Universalis. Much of Albert's empirical contributions to the natural sciences have been superseded, but his general approach to science may be surprisingly modern. For example, in De Mineralibus, Albert claims, "For it is the task of natural science not simply to accept what we are told, but to inquire into the causes of natural things."
Albert the Great passed on to his reward in 1280 at the age of somewhere around 80. He was beatified in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. He was canonized in 1931 by Pope Pius XI, and at the same time, he was proclaimed a doctor of the Church, meaning that today he's one of the Church's top 40 theologians. And in 1941, he was proclaimed the patron of natural scientists.
Since we're focusing on the mysterious aspect of Albert's work, let's talk a bit about Albert the Great and magic. What should we know here?
One of the things we need to know about is the difference between natural magic and ceremonial magic. The term ceremonial magic comes from the 1500s, so after Albert's time, but the basic concept was there earlier. Natural magic refers to hidden or occult properties of the natural world that you can use to do things. As we discussed in episodes 105 and 106 on St. Thomas Aquinas and the occult, the Latin word occultus just means hidden. So anything that's hidden from the knowledge of man is occult. It doesn't mean evil or demonic. It just means something we don't know about or don't know much about. As we pointed out in those episodes, St. Thomas Aquinas gave magnets and their ability to attract iron as an example of a hidden or occult virtue. He didn't think that magnets were evil or demonic, just that they had a power whose workings were hidden from the knowledge of man. And how that power works wouldn't be discovered until the early 20th century with the development of quantum mechanics. Similarly, when Sir Isaac Newton proposed the idea of gravity in the 1600s, he was accused of introducing a concept from natural magic, since the idea that one body could have an influence over another body at a distance with nothing connecting them violated a rule from Aristotelian physics that said there was no such thing as action at a distance. In any event, it was widely recognized that nature contained hidden or occult principles, or as we would say, undiscovered ones, and you could use them to do things. So that's what natural magic was. And since it was in principle a form of science, a kind of newfangled fringe science, natural magic was viewed more positively than the alternative, which was ceremonial magic. Like I said, this term comes from the 1500s, but in Albert's day, the same basic thing existed, only that same basic thing was called necromancy. Ceremonial magic didn't just involve hidden principles in nature. Instead, it involved contacting spirits and getting stuff from them, either hidden knowledge or deeds you wanted done. Sometimes the spirits were thought to be angels, sometimes they were said to be demons, and sometimes they were something else. But ceremonial magic was looked on much less favorably than natural magic, although it did have its defenders, as we'll talk about in a future episode on the medieval clerical necromantic underworld.
Medieval thinkers like Albert also had ideas about astronomy and astrology that will be important for today's episode. What should we know here?
As we discussed in episodes 105 and 106, there wasn't a solid distinction between astronomy and astrology in the Middle Ages, and they had a different model also of how the universe works than we do, as we discussed in episode 206 on how we found the universe. The idea was that at the center of the universe was the Earth, which was a sphere. In fact, Albert the Great is known for working out a proof that the Earth is a sphere. And around the Earth, there were a set of transparent spheres that held the stars. At the time, the term star was used for any light in the sky. So it included not only what we would think of as stars, but also the planets, the sun, and our sister planet, the moon. These stars were divided into two kinds. First, there were the fixed stars that don't seem to change their positions relative to each other so that they make up the constellations. And second, there were the seven stars that seem to wander around against the background of the fixed stars. These seven wanderers were the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which are the only wanderers that you can see with the naked eye. Well, the Greek term for wanderer is planetes, so the seven wandering stars were the seven planets, including the sun and the moon. They were classified as planets too. The idea was that the seven planets are embedded on the celestial spheres, which cause them to move around the sky, and the fixed stars were embedded on the outermost sphere past the sphere of Saturn. The ancients tried to work out the order of the spheres, and they reasoned that the sphere of the moon must be the closest to Earth. And there was a big difference between everything that was under the sphere of the moon and everything that was beyond it. Down here on Earth, we see the four classical elements of air, fire, water, and earth, but we don't see those with the naked eye up in space. We also see lots of change happening down here on Earth, but we don't see change out in the heavens. The stars, whether fixed or wandering, just go through their seemingly endless orbits over and over again. So it was reasoned that they must be made out of a different stuff. The four classical elements existed down here on Earth, but everything from the moon on up was made out of something else. Aristotle referred to this fifth element as ether. So the stars, the planets, and the transparent spheres were all made out of ether. And it obeyed different laws than the four classical elements do. So we have one set of laws operating down here on Earth, and these can be discovered by natural philosophy, or science as we would now call it. And there's another set of laws operating up in the heavens. This means that there is a big difference between what's called the sublunar realm, where we live, that is the region below the moon, and everything above it. This will be important in the discussion of St. Albert the Great, as it was also in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. For example, Albert and Thomas both believed that each planet had a spirit or angel that causes it to move. These spirits were obviously very powerful since they move planets, and they obviously have an influence down here on Earth, like how the sun controls our weather and agricultural cycle. So many people in the Middle Ages were interested in trying to find a way to harness this power to do things, which is part of magic.
One other subject that's important for today's discussion is alchemy. What should we know about that?
Alchemy was the discipline that eventually gave rise to modern chemistry. So just like there was no distinction between astronomy and astrology in Albert's day, there was also no distinction between chemistry and alchemy. The holy grail of alchemy was figuring out how to turn a base metal like lead into a precious metal like gold, though there was a lot more to alchemy than that, but that was the holy grail. Unfortunately, in order to turn lead into gold, you need modern atomic theory of matter, an understanding of radioactivity, and a device like a handy-dandy cyclotron, but they didn't have those things in Albert's day. One way to do the transmutation is to take lead, or element 82, and use the cyclotron to give it more protons and jack it up into being a higher radioactive element, and then you can wait for that radioactive element to decay into element 79, or gold. Another way to do the transmutation is to take lead and then knock 3 protons out of it, as explained in this short from Scientific American.
You know how alchemists used to try turning lead into gold? Well, scientists did it, for real. This happened at CERN, where they've got the Large Hadron Collider, which is basically a giant underground ring that smashes particles together at close to the speed of light. In this case, they aimed 2 beams of lead ions at each other, and in instances where the ions didn't collide, but instead grazed each other, the electromagnetic field was so intense that it knocked out 3 protons out of the nucleus. And a lead ion that loses 3 protons just becomes gold. A fully different thing. In total, the experiment called ALICE was able to spot the creation of 86 billion gold nuclei over the course of the accelerator's run from 2015 to 2018, which sounds like a lot, but it's only 29 trillionths of a gram of gold. And also, these gold nuclei only lasted for a fraction of a second before they smashed into the side of the machine or disintegrated into other particles. So the alchemists were right, kind of. All they needed was a particle accelerator and no plans to cash in.
Of course, not having the things needed to do true nuclear transmutation, alchemists in Albert's day couldn't really change one element into another, but they still laid the groundwork for modern chemistry, and figures like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas were quite interested in alchemy, which we'll also have a future episode on.
Okay, if that's what we need to know, let's now watch Dr. Justin Sledge's presentation on St. Albert the Great, but first, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make the show possible, including Sam M., Kyle C., Molly N., James K., and Kimberly M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com.
The medieval church played, let's call it, a complicated role in the development of the Western magical tradition. While often considered from the point of view of the sorcery trials, the tortures of the Inquisition, or the witch trials that raged for centuries during the early modern period, the church of the period of high scholasticism, beginning at the very beginning of the mid-12th century, was much more complicated in how it dealt with the practice of magic, even how it dealt with the practice of something like necromancy, a crime at that time. And this is nowhere more apparent than the life, writings, and teachings and the magical practice of Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, the Doctor Universalis, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, and the bedrock of scholastic philosophy. His student Ulrich of Strasbourg claimed that he was inspired in all fields of knowledge and experienced in the magical arts. And indeed, a generation after him, Johannes de Beck famously declared that Albertus Magnus was great in necromancy, greater in philosophy, but greatest still in theology. But still great in necromancy. And for 800 years, Albertus Magnus has been associated with magic and the occult, from his authentic writings to grimoires detailing the use of a corpse's hand as sinister sorcery. But what does Albertus's actual writings reveal about the position of magic, divination, astrology, the production of talismans, and perhaps even most shocking, his own interactions and experimentations with non-physical entities? What can we learn about the occult works attributed to him? And most importantly, what's his position on magic reveal about just how complicated the relationship between Christianity and the occult has been through history? I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica. I'd hope you considered subscribing and supporting the work I do here by taking a look at my Patreon or some of the cool merch that we have on the channel. But now, let's take a look at the history of Christian occultism, the 13th century universal genius, Albertus Magnus. Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Probably born in the decade just prior to the turn of the monumental 13th century and living for over 80 years, Albert of Launingen was born into just a touch of privilege. Educated in Aristotle at Padua, who'd become a Dominican in the 1220s, and he began lecturing both at the most prestigious theological institution in Europe at that time, there at Paris, but also closer to his home at Cologne in Germany. During this time, he became the teacher of none less than Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest luminaries the West has ever produced. Among numerous other brilliant students, he would begin to compose commentaries on virtually all of the works of Aristotle with the aid of the great Muslim philosophers. Especially influencing him were Avicenna and Averroes. Indeed, Albert was said to have taken up the task of doing nothing less than completing the works of that great Stagirite, completing the works of Aristotle. Albert would rise through the ranks of his order. He would be sent on peace delegations, both sacred and secular, and he would help to found the great University of Cologne, still standing hundreds of years later in that city. He would rise to the rank of bishop only to resign that position a few years later, and his learning was absolutely astounding. The 1899 collected work spanned some 39 substantial volumes covering virtually every domain of medieval human knowledge, and as we'll see, even some superhuman knowledge. He would outlive many of his students, and he would pass from this world on the 15th of November, 1280. He would eventually become canonized and proclaimed a doctor of the Church on the 16th of December, 1931, by Pope Pius XI, and is now recognized as a patron saint of scientists. But, as we'll see through this episode, he could just as well be the patron saint of sorcerer, as he very carefully and very often blurred the line between natural and supernatural philosophy. But part of what makes it difficult to appreciate Albertus Magnus as Albertus Magus are a few issues. The first is his massive and difficult philosophical, religious, and scientific output, in which he positions himself on topics in the occult that are often just buried in otherwise extremely difficult scholastic philosophy, as if you wanted to wade through all that to get an off-the-cuff statement about summoning spirits. Secondly, Albertus is actually very careful to address such occult topics with differing degrees of focus, clarification, and even condemnation, strategic condemnation, based on the topic of the scope of his discussion. For instance, his earlier theological works are much more quickly to condemn sorcery, especially sorcery having to do with the conjuration of spirits, than, say, his more strictly philosophical or scientific works. Thus, theology might bury that subtlety or that distinction which is otherwise present in other works, which in turn otherwise greatly lessens a stricture on occult practice. What's really clearly condemned in a theological work is going to have a bit more wiggle room in one of the scientific or philosophical ones. Thus, a blanket condemnation on spirit conjuration in his early commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard is significantly retracted or at least tweaked, perhaps sometimes even reversed by his own confession in, for instance, his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, as we'll see. Finally, there are a range of texts attributed to Albert, from alchemical treatises to diabolical grimoires, which have accumulated over the centuries. Now, some of these texts were likely produced within Dominican circles of Albert, perhaps by his students, or maybe even reflecting his own thoughts. They might even be by him for all we know, while others are as wonderful as they are completely spurious and fraudulent, produced centuries after Albert's death. Thus, to get at the occult philosophy of Albertus Magnus and really at the foundations of Christian occultism, we have to take a rather difficult synoptic glimpse of his work, letting his scientific and philosophical dimension often temper his more sacred strictness or strictures before then turning to those Pseudo-Albertine or Albertine-adjacent texts which ultimately produce his legacy as both a scholastic and as an occult philosopher. But to appreciate Albertus Magnus as Albertus Magus, we must first appreciate the inheritance of the language of magic that he's received through the history of Christianity. Specifically, Augustine and Isidore of Seville both taxonomized and largely discredited the practice of magic, nearly entirely taken as the work of just demonic trickery. And while William of Auvergne, a generation prior to Albert, would introduce the concept of natural magic to denote the processes of detecting, unlocking, and instrumentalizing hidden forces of nature, Albert, for whatever reason, just doesn't take that tract at all. Indeed, rather shockingly, he just adopts the otherwise scandalous term negromantia or necromantia, a term most often associated exactly with diabolism and pacts with demons. Or at least it would be soon after Albert's death. But even around Albert's time, this term was also undergoing subtle transformations. Petrus of Fonzi and Godelissimus would go on to classify negromantia or necromantia according to physics. They claimed it as a division of physics, as one of the liberal arts, divided into 9 parts dealing with elemental, spiritual, and demonic magic, and further associations of medicine, navigation, or optics, but most specifically with the production of talismans, astrology, and alchemy, getting us in more firmly esoteric land. Thus, the generation prior to Albertus Magnus was already setting the stage for a general loosening up of some of those restrictions inherited from Isidore and Augustine, which had existed prior and which would actually go on to be reinforced after Albert. For instance, his student, Thomas Aquinas, would be much more definitive and strict on a range of just these topics, especially, ironically, or not ironically, the conjuration of spirits, the practice of astrology, and the transmutation of metals via alchemy. Thus, Albertus Magnus lived at just the right moment for a very brief but very important renaissance in Christian occultism, something that wouldn't be seen again until the latter part of the 15th century. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Albert's comments on the occult, while often surprising and even shocking to us, are often just buried in rather daunting terms. Further, his theological writings remain pretty conservative and even unsubtle on these topics, often just echoing previous generations of theologians, especially Augustine and Peter Lombard. However, in his more philosophical and especially his scientific works, we are likely hearing the more genuine positions of the experimentalist Albert. These works often take the form of commentaries on Aristotle in which Albert attempts to bring to bear and synthesize both Aristotle but also the Arabic commentaries, but most important of all for our purposes, his own experimental evidence and the experimental evidence of his colleagues. These works span the gamut from biology, meteorology, the study of animals and plants, and especially mineralogy, among much, much more. And key to appreciating this work is how Albert attempts to marry the lore and philosophy that he's inherited, much of which just often strains credulity, with the knowledge he's acquired either through appeal to ancient or modern expertise arrived at through ancient authority, but especially, and this is what's crucially important about Albert, especially his own experience as the result of testing. Specifically, Albert will often echo some inherited lore from the ye old days of old, and then he would note to which degree he agrees with that lore based on his own or his colleagues' experimental evidence. Now, to be sure, I'm not trying to say here that Albert is an 18th century British empiricist or something, but he's clearly interested in putting that arcane lore that he's inherited into communication with his own or his colleagues' own experimental experience, and you constantly see him in his writing saying, I have confirmed this, I don't believe that, that seems to work, this seems like craziness. He seems to sound a bit like an experimentalist. And perhaps that's on most scandalous display on how one of his conclusions is borne out by reason and his interest in the occult become married in what is otherwise a just offhanded comment on his commentary buried at the beginning of Aristotle's De Anima. At 126, Albert's discussing whether an incorporeal agent, such as a spirit or an angel or demon for that matter, can move itself or be the source of movement. And rather than just appealing to a purely philosophical deduction, he actually appeals to both the ancient sources of wisdom, Socrates and Hermes Trismegistus, such the movement of such gods, as he denotes them, or actually indeed possible. In fact, he then appeals directly to his milieu, and he says this is affirmed by diviners and spellcasters in the present day. But for Albert, he concludes himself that for his part, these gods, quod angelos vademonos volcant, et anima exaltae ac corporis moventor ad de loco ad locum, quis veritatem etiam nos ipsi sumus experiti in magicis, which we call these beings angels and demons, and souls stripped from bodies, yet move from place to place, which we ourselves have verified the truth whereof with the art of magic. Yep, you just heard that one of the most important theologians in the history of the Catholic Church just admitted to knowing that incorporeal beings can move around because he's confirmed it through the practice of magic. But let's put some bumpers on that before we get all too excited. In this theological work, such as the commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, Albert clearly condemns any magic that involves invocations, conjurations, sacrifices, suffumigations, and adorations. Typical condemnation for dealing with demonic entities at the time. However, and unlike his student Thomas, Albert nowhere deals with the concept of the pact with the devil that will become part and parcel of the later witch heresy. But given his guardrail, as much as it is a guardrail, and it's never lowered, you can never do any of that kind of stuff according to Albert, how does this square with his comment in the De Anima? It has to do with how Albert conceptualizes magic, or magica as he most often denotes it, but also how he conceives of those incorporeal entities he's just interacted with and told us about as magic. For Albert, the anima or soul is above all the principle of animation or movement, specifically intelligent autonomous movement. For his part, he suggests that there must exist spiritual creatures, such as angels, but also the righteous dead, but also immaterial intelligences which are separate from the physical sublunar world and probably deathless, at least to some degree, developing a kind of Christianized version of Aristotle's metaphysical cosmology. Albert contends that the superlunar world, the world above the moon, is populated by a series of celestial intelligences associated with the stars, with the planets, and the fixed stars, which are all instruments of causation between the very remote divine first cause and the sublunar physical world in which we dwell. These non-material celestial intelligences work as instruments of the divine will, reaching down through the heavens and serving as the cause which actually propels our world, all of the physical world. Again, all physical things, according to this philosophy, need something to cause them to move about, and the physical sublunar world can only ultimately be caused by a superlunar immaterial celestial realm. These celestial intelligences or influences reach down via non-physical causation and are ultimately the cause of such movements as the winds, the tides, and further invisible forces such as the sun's ability to cause growth, even reaching down into the darkness of the soil to cause seeds to sprout and then reach toward the light. The influence of the sun is pulling them up in some sense. Our physical world is simply bathed in these celestial influences, some of which are visible, like the light of the sun or the effects of Jupiter as lightning, or the tug of the oceans by the lunar tides, at least visible to us in terms of their effects. But most of them are invisible and thus occult, or simply hidden. Indeed, at any given moment, the world is simply crisscrossed with a vast system of celestial tides and the objects infused with exactly those celestial influences, hidden influences which create the causal structure and the interactions of the world in which we dwell. But what if we could detect just those hidden celestial influences which rain down from the vast superlunar intelligences, and not just detect them, but instrumentalize them to empower the human being to do the will of God, a divine will communicated directly to human beings in just those influences? That investigation, detection, and instrumentalization of the hidden occult web of immaterial celestial influences is just what Albert the Great terms ars magica, the art of magic. And yeah, this is all downstream of Ibn Sina, or now we're fairly confident, pseudo-Ibn Sina's book on astral radiation, De Radiis, known often in the Latin West, inappropriately, as simply On the Theory of Magic. Albert develops and deploys this idea over a great deal of his work, but it's on display in the most practical sense in 3 of his major books: his work on animals, his work on plants, and especially in his book on minerals. The work on minerals, De Mineralibus, is perhaps the closest thing that Albert ever wrote to a practical guide to his conception of magica. In fact, that's probably why it remains one of his most popular texts. And here he details the theory and practice of not employing not only the occult powers of stones, gems, and metals, but also the processes by which those special forms which radiate down through the cosmic spheres may be captured in the form of magical talismans. Indeed, he even declares that, quote, the necromancy of images and seals is a good doctrine. Of course, stones, gems, and metals all share specific natural qualities which can be put to a range of purposes, but incantations, charactare, signs, and even sacrifices can be used as a kind of focus with specific astral timings to capture specific celestial forces onto things like engraved mineral elements, thus imbuing them with power over and above their mere natural properties, which still strike us as pretty esoteric-y. And relying on the inherited knowledge of both recent medieval guides, but also the received wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, the Hermetic pagans like Thabit ibn Qurra, the Babylonian Germa, the Greek Ptolemy, and Magor the Greek, among other people who we don't know who they are. And Albert's On the Minerals proved to be one of the most successful mineralogical grimoires of the Middle Ages and beyond. It's still popular. And yet, his student Thomas Aquinas would reject talismanic magic as inevitably demonic, ultimately requiring satanic aid to be effective in the end. Of course, his subsequent work on animals and plants would continue this line of thinking, now providing encyclopedic discussion, theory, and practice for using plants, herbs, and animals, mostly parts of animals, for magical ends. From making herbal incense, the curative power of plants, or even the magical use of plants to do things like open locks, along with the production of herbal talismans which would be suspended or even worn for specific magical ends. His work on animals has to do more with the range of how various parts of those animals can be used to do things like inspire love, drive away demons. Fish livers are good for that, as per the driving away of Asmodeus by Tobit. They could hold ships in place or hold the secrets of the future in their entrails, as in the ancient customs of augury. Of special interest is his discussion of the hoopoe bird, a bird of ancient mystique which appears in numerous manuals of magic, perhaps most infamously in the Picatrix. Indeed, we even learn of combining mineral and animal magic, learning that the Corteria stone, a magical stone of some significance in De Mineralibus, can actually be found often in the nest of just that bird. Albert also deals alternative with a variety of topics on occult forces through his works as well. For instance, he's interested in the power of fascination, something akin to what we probably now denote as hypnosis, exploring a range of possible causes. He finally seems to land on the idea that a kind of celestial-infused personality trait of the fascinator, a bit like the power of charisma, I might say, is ultimately the grounds for the power of fascination itself. He also has surprisingly little to say about witchcraft or maleficia, a topic that people become absolutely obsessed with in later centuries, but he takes it to be basically the work of those seduced by malign demons and ultimately tricked with various kinds of mechanisms to basically get their soul stolen. Again, these surprisingly sparse discussions occur primarily in his theological writings, and their relative paucity is a far cry from the absolute obsessions of later demonologists with tales of witchcraft and pacts with the devil and making dudes' peepees disappear, all topics missing, thankfully, from Albert's considerations. Further, he does discuss divination to some degree, both positively and negatively. Prophecy is, of course, possible and can be communicated via the divine will through the stars, even in the natural world around us. A bit like you can see the weather coming down the road. Indeed, the stars can communicate the divine will, but they cannot determine the inner, immaterial life of ethical choice and the free movement of the mind, or soul, the anima. Those are basically the same thing in medieval thinking to a significant degree. Physical bodies, including our body and other extended things in space, are subject to indirect divine will through the direct influences of those celestial forces out there. Thus, astral fate binds bodies, but not souls or minds. Hence Albert's general reluctance for the acceptance of human horoscopes as anything more than predicting trends or forces at play rather than determinative causation in the form of fate and destiny. Again, a topic that's taken up into Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, with a great deal of ink being spilled about how do you square the circle of astrological destiny versus free will. Of course, it being the Middle Ages, alchemy is another domain of the occult sciences that Albert takes up, though again here with a bit more skepticism. He agrees with Ibn Sina's commentary on Aristotle's meteorology, which most people thought was actually just Aristotle because of how the manuscripts got copied. Basically, Ibn Sina's colophon to the text ended up being built into the manuscript's translation, and people just thought Ibn Sina was Aristotle. But at any rate, the argument is that one species of metal can't be transformed into any other species of metal any more than a dog can be transformed into a cow or something. But Albert did hold that alchemical gold and silver could be produced such that, at least in appearance, they were completely indistinguishable by the means of precious metal assay. So they were really, really close, even if they didn't change species. But how could they be told apart then? Of course, by their occult properties. Specifically, alchemical gold and silver would lack the specifically beneficial medical occult properties laid out in his book De Mineralibus. Thus, while alchemy could have apparent success, it would always lack in its fundamentally occult power to fully transmute one species to another. Interestingly enough, it's for this reason that Albert places alchemy between the realm of the sciences and the realm of the occult arts, but much closer to magic than science. And this brings me to what really separates, at least for Albert, the difference between the categories of natural philosophy, or science as we might call it, and magica, the art of magic. They're questions of precision. For Albert, natural philosophy is driven by the senses to apparent phenomena marked by their consistency and the ability to put that consistency to the test through experimentation. Thus, the findings of natural philosophy can be placed within syllogistic logic, and one can, through good old-fashioned logic chopping, arrive at consistent truths. It's that logical and observational consistency that anchors natural philosophy as a discipline, as science for Albert. Magica, on the other hand, is the work of hidden occult forces which operate in perhaps necessarily inconsistent and thus unpredictable means. Well, why aren't they so consistent? Well, they're not apparently consistent to us, at least. Recall all that astral radiation raining down our world? Well, it's marked by extreme complexity. Think about the charts upon charts upon charts tracking the various cycles and epicycles of the planets and the movement of the zodiac, and even the slow tracking of the fixed stars on the background. All of those charts were there because even the seemingly regular movement of the planets became erratic and unpredictable long enough out in predictions. Further, those planets sit within crystalline spheres whereby their celestial radiation can pour down for sure, but also mix, make interference patterns, combine, cancel. They could enhance each other. There's so many different simultaneous forces falling upon the Earth that how can you predict the interactions once they even get here? This massive complexity means that the outcome of magic, outside of a very narrow scope of analysis and testing and deployment, are almost always by nature too difficult for our puny little brains to predict. Thus, with consistency and prediction not really being available to the would-be magus, magic simply can't be thought of as a science or an episteme, despite its ostensible power. It's much more trial and error, and effective magic can take centuries to work out in any detail, and that's why it's so important for Albert to recover as much from the past as possible, because everything those ancient sages had learned was really hard fought in the getting. In summation, Albert's theory of magic was the attempt to discover, understand, and manipulate unseen and thus occult celestial forces and their effects upon the sublunar world, our world. In a sense, this is natural magic, using the occult powers of herbs, minerals, and animals, but in a sense it's also supernatural in the sense that those powers stem from a world beyond the physics of our sublunar world. There's a whole different physics operating above the moon. Up there, originating in the divine will, then transmitted to the celestial spheres, those occult forces are the indirect hand of God. By grasping this hidden divine hand in nature, can the magus help to shepherd being to that great final form of causation? Final causation. Perfection. Thus, unlocking those special forms in nature, the magus can come to wield divine-like powers over nature itself, just as Adam did in paradise. Of course, this enthusiasm for the art of magic would not be shared by students of Albert like Thomas Aquinas, and thus the theology faculty of Paris would remain highly antagonistic toward the practice, ultimately resulting in the condemnation of sorcery in 1398. Definitely proving that the condemnation didn't work. There was a lot of sorcerers in Paris. The University of Cologne, on the other hand, co-founded by Albert himself, would continue more so in this tradition. Thus, scholasticism itself can be split into sort of a Thomistic versus a Albertistic form of scholasticism, and indeed this focus on the occult would be one of the features that would mark out the University of Cologne versus almost everywhere else in the scholastic world. This milieu would eventually produce the famous abbot of Sponheim, Trithemius, one of the true experts of the occult in the 15th century, as it gave way to the 16th, and indeed his abbey library would be one of the most substantial, if not the most substantial, occult libraries in all of Europe. And, of course, the University of Cologne would produce none other than Heinricus Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the famous and decisive 3 books of occult philosophy, along with many other hermetic volumes. And that would produce a world that would remember fondly both the historical Albert, but also his focus on the magic of the mythical Albert, we might say, the magical Albert. And it would be that magical Albert, truly a mage among mages, that was already developing well before Albert himself passed from this world. His student Thomas Aquinas claimed that Albert had cast a demon from a room in a show of his power over the forces of evil. Tales even began to circulate that God had allowed Albert to visit purgatory while alive to better write on the subject. He was said to have been given secrets to complete the more exoteric works of Aristotle, producing a kind of esoteric Aristotle. Indeed, he'd even been given special dispensation by the church to summon spirits and demons in order to best learn how to combat that very evil. But all of these increasingly legendary sources agreed on the titanic learning and deep piety of Albertus Magnus. However, some sources did not always agree that he was so pious, at least to start. A famous tale told of a youth, the youthful Albert, who employed magic to seduce women, including a royal princess, and caught in his lustful necromancy, he would spend the rest of his life in penance, using just those magical skills in the defense of good Christians. Perhaps one of the most famous tales told, not only of Albert, but of several scholars of this time, including Roger Bacon and Robogrossatessa, was that Albert had constructed a brazen head, a kind of medieval automaton using astronomical timings imbued with such an intelligence that it could speak and even answer questions if those questions were often just basic yes or no questions. Allegedly, a friar found the head in Albert's room and destroyed it as a kind of abomination. Albert himself lamented the destruction of the brazen head because the astral conditions for reconstructing such a magical device would only occur like 30,000 years into the future. These medieval brazen heads, by the way, would just make a good episode in themselves, so that's coming. They kind of remind me of artifacts from like old school Magic the Gathering, like Urza and Misha. But by the end of the 15th century, there's even a Middle English poem of Albert meeting with the Queen of the Elves. Now we're in Dungeons and Dragons somehow. The Queen of the Elves, Elzachel, in Damascus in Syria, where he's given, of course, an elixir to transmute metals. Now, to what degree Albert the Great practiced magic in his lifetime may be the subject of debate, or the kind of magic that he practiced, but after his death, he, like Michael Scott and Pietro de Urbano and Thomas Aquinas for that matter, all became mages and alchemists par excellence. But not only did Albert become the stuff of legend, but many magical and alchemical works began to be attributed to him, some even probably within the last period of his lifetime, and probably originating within his own students and fellow Dominicans. And thus we have the veritable occult library of the works of pseudo Albertus Magnus. Now, the problems with the works of pseudo-Albert is that they run the range from perhaps being written by the man himself to clear forgeries written hundreds of years after his death. He was pretty magical, but it's hard to write books when you're dead. But further, many of them, especially the earlier works, are actually important and interesting works in the history of Western esotericism, and they're just worthy of study regardless of who wrote them. Indeed, as Collins points out, the pseudo-Albertine works have probably actually ended up having a more decisive impact than the actual stuff that Albert wrote. I mean, ask yourself, when's the last time you read a work by Albertus Magnus that wasn't one of these magical books? Hold on. That's probably not a fair question to be asking this crowd. But at any rate, I mean, how many times have you read his books on the metaphysics or physics? No one reads this stuff. That said, one of the most popular such collections of pseudo-Albertine works, at least early on, is the Liber Aggregationis, which is a collected volume describing the various physical and metaphysical virtues of herbs, stones, and animals, along with a similar attached volume on the wonders of the world, which details various tales of the marvelous. Unsurprisingly, they sound a bunch like Albert's works. The Book of Virtues, or the Secreti Alberti, is a similar collection dealing with the magic of plants and other stones and animals, though in this text there's a peculiar financial focus, that is to say the magical powers of the financial virtues of these things, which we could all use a bit of that these days. Again, all of these collections are either based on earlier texts like Islamic or Jewish works on herbs. In fact, Albert's earlier work on herbs is in fact based on a Jewish text, and gems along with other things, and these writings are largely thought to be produced at least somewhat contemporaneously and perhaps within the circle of Albert himself. The incredibly popular De Secretis Mulieribus, or On the Secrets of Women, also has its origins in the 13th or 14th century Dominican circles and is a detailed account of various gynecological matters, including human generation, embryonic development, signs of virginity, the birth process, and monstrous births, along with analyses of bodily fluids, especially menses and semen, along with how to determine the sex of an infant prior to birth. Again, this is similar to the kind of stuff that Albert wrote in his commentaries on generation and destruction. The volume also contains a detailed analysis of astral influences on fetal development, especially the influence of the ominous Saturn, in terms of personality and physical development. Again, this is probably not written by Albert, but it's so Albertine in its insights that the topics from a medieval perspective, all with proper caveats. Medieval dudes don't know a lot about what's going on with women, but it's very Albertine in the way that it goes about trying to prove what it's arguing. But none of these works were included in the 1651 collected works of Albert, but they did begin to appear printed together in the 15th century and became known in French as Le Grand Albert. Again, together they were very popular and were continuously in print together or as separate tracts. I have a couple of copies of De Secretis Mulieribus. In fact, I think there's one for sale on the Rare Book site right now, and these continue to be printed all the way into early modern printing. Perhaps expanding on Albert's De Mineralibus, an alchemical text began to appear in his name shortly after his death, again often appearing very Albertine in their methodology. Even some early manuscripts of the decisively important Summa Perfectionis of Pseudo Gerber, itself probably composed by Paul of Taranto, were even ascribed to Albert. And I've done a whole video on that one, by the way, on the Summa Perfectionis, which is perhaps one of the most important alchemical texts ever produced in the Middle Ages. But the most famous of these tracts would be the Samhita Recta, which is a relatively straightforward guide to introductory alchemy, including theories on how to transfer metals, details on various substances, equipment checklists, operations for producing gold and silver, at least in some bare detail. In this way, it's kind of a beginner's guide or a practical guide to match the more theoretical quality of the De Mineralibus. The Libellus de Alchemia, which would first appear in the final volume of Albert's 1651 opera Omnia as spurious, but still worthy of collection, is another example of what Thorndike actually calls an unusually intelligible treatise for the work of alchemy, which is about as high praise as you're going to get from Lynn Thorndike, and still a fantastic resource for students of the Hermetic art today who want to get a sense of how medieval people thought about alchemy. Typically divided into 57 relatively brief chapters, this text describes a seeker failing to find a true teacher of alchemy, but who has now learned and will recount what he has learned, and only that which he himself is tested. Sounds like Albert. That value placed on what he has tested gives the text its truly Albertine tone. What follows is a systematic treatise on learned alchemy of the period, including the construction of a lab, the correct astrological seasons for alchemical work, the various virtues needed of a good alchemist, the proper order of the alchemical processes, the necessary alchemical equipment, all of which needs to be made in glass, by the way, so you can observe the changes therein, something we also know for alchemists like John Rupesisha, their correct kind of furnaces, ceramics, theoretical discussions of the degree to which alchemical transmutation is possible, a point made by both Ibn Sina and Albert, the various substances and processes used in alchemical change, and finally recipes for transmutation itself. It wouldn't be a good alchemy book without a good transmutation recipe. All in all, the Libellus de Alchemia, if not written by Albert, is very much an Albertine introduction for the Hermetic art, representing it accurately for the High Middle Ages, and absolutely worth studying, and it's going to get its own episode. Finally, the much discussed Speculum Astronomiae is also attributed and denied to Albertus Magnus, depending on who you ask. But needless to say, this is one of the most important works on astronomy astrology of the entire period, and again, one very much in line with Albert's thought. It focuses on how, while astral influences do flow down to Earth and determine the body, they do not have such an effect upon the mind and the soul, thus allowing for human freedom, a point that Albert makes. But given that the body does influence the mind and the soul, knowing the influx of such influences can help secure proper inner virtue against such influences. A Stoic idea, in fact. Thus, it allows for a limited astral influence, but again, still securing free will and moral choice. Indeed, the text seems to be following an argument made by Abu Mashar that astrology, properly understood, would actually aid in securing moral virtue, not negating it, much less erasing moral choice through astral determinism, something very much needed through voluntaristic religions like Islam and Christianity. The speculum became widely influential, inviting commentary and criticism from all corners, and to this day, the question of its Albertine authorship continues to be debated. All of these various texts would go through numerous editions. The Grand Albert would be expanded over time, mutating all the while to include a wide range of text before eventually being translated into the various vernaculars, including English. Of course, the Grand Albert would eventually invite the production of the Petit Albert, a notorious French grimoire of the early 18th century, and this little volume, printed small enough that it could be fit into saddlebags and smuggled around, was a incredibly popular grimoire, and it's going to get its own episode because it's just the most fun mishmash of black magic and alchemy typical of the time, most famously depicting, of course, the Hand of Glory, most often a mummified hand of an executed criminal, the hand which could be used for various nefarious ends, and continues to show up in film and art down to this day. The vicissitudes of Albert the Great's legacy would go through various reversals in time. He would be hailed as a foundation for the church, bemoaned as a sorcerer, reclaimed as a scientist, and eventually praised as a saint. Sadly, the works of Albert the Great remain very much understudied, and he's kind of to blame for it. Thomas Aquinas is kind of to blame for it, to call the thunder. But David Collins' recent study is absolutely the best at locating Albert in the history of Western esotericism. But if you want access to some of the litany of marvels in Albert's works, many of them are recounted with a bit of derision in Volume 2 of Thorndike's History of Magic and Experimental Science. Translations of Albert's works are just all over the place, frankly, but I'll include links to some pretty good editions of his works, especially works that are germane to Western esotericism and works attributed to him in the description, so at least you'll get some idea of at least the more esoteric-y works. Of course, Christian occultism is fascinating and a frankly little explored topic, so I'm going to be coming back to it time and time again to be sure, including specific episodes on many of the texts outlined in this episode, because this is just a very thin overview of the importance of Albert the Great. It's even in his specific contributions to the foundations of Western esotericism, and specifically Christian occultism. But until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
And that was Dr. Justin Sledge's presentation on Albert the Great. Jimmy, before we go on, let me ask you a question. In light of Albert's connection with magic, how is it that he's a doctor of the church?
It's an interesting question, and there are several factors that are involved. If you'd like a scholarly discussion of that subject, I suggest checking out the book Disenchanting Albert the Great by the Jesuit scholar David Collins. One of the things you heard Justin discuss was how much material was falsely attributed to Albert after his death. A lot of that material is just legendary rather than historical, and when looking at canonizing Albert and declaring him a doctor, the church basically sought to set aside all the pseudo-Albertine material. Of course, the fact that there was so much material by pseudo-Albert suggests that there was a basis for associating Albert with magic, even if it was much less of a basis than the legend that later grew up suggested. But to the extent that Albert was interested in natural magic or hidden principles in nature, what he was doing was essentially a form of early science or proto-science rather than what we would think of as magic. He was separating what he saw as natural principles from things done by demons and thus seeking to increase what we would think of as scientific understanding. And when it comes to the limited ceremonial magic that Albert may have done, it may have involved angelic or human spirits. It also has to be judged by the standards of his time. This is something that applies to all saints and doctors of the church. They're only held accountable for what had been mandated by the church in their own day. Thus, St. Thomas Aquinas can still be a saint and a doctor of the church, even though he didn't believe in the Immaculate Conception of Mary the way it's now understood. In the same way, Albert's ceremonial magic experiments must be evaluated in terms of the flexibility that there was in his day on this topic. Albert also rejected multiple magical practices as fundamentally unacceptable, as you heard Justin mention, and these included involvement with demons. So he was trying to distinguish between permissible magic, like natural magic, and impermissible forms of magic. Even to this day, it's debated how much Albert was actually involved in magic, but it seems to have been a quite small amount of his otherwise voluminous work. Like Justin mentioned, he just makes short, offhanded remarks about it in otherwise massive text. It's not like he has a whole book of magic somewhere. Fundamentally, though, this small amount of potentially problematic material has to be weighed against the value of Albert's overall theological, philosophical, and scientific work. And it was judged that a small amount of doubtful, problematic material simply didn't outweigh the value of the massive positive work of the Doctor Universalis. In his book, Collins describes how the discussion of Albert proceeded.
Late 18th century treatments of Albert's investigations of the natural world without concern for magic moved his reputation across a significant threshold. Worry about and inquiry into his magical engagements were effectively marginalized in scientific, philosophical, and theological discourse. While the encyclopedic consensus did not dispel the image of Albert as a magician, when it appeared, it was disconnected from the writings and debates we have pursued over the preceding chapters. Albert's reputation for magic could not be avoided altogether in the renewed biographical research. This time, however, new appreciation of what the magical arts may have been, and new approaches in the historical scholarship on pre-modern science made dismissing any apprehension of his magic easy as never before. The new biographers presented magic as proto-science where they could. Where they could not, they placed the magical under the rubric of legend. Pope Pius XI canonized Albert equipolently, that is, after an abbreviated process, on the 16th of December, 1931, and declared him a doctor of the Church at the same time. Whether Albert's reputation as a magician had ever been a genuine impediment to his canonization is far from certain. Canonization was so rare. No single pope presided over more than 12 such ceremonies before the 19th century, that the question one should puzzle is not why someone is not canonized, but why someone ever is. In any event, magic was not an issue in the process that ultimately succeeded. Pius's decisions to canonize favored the learned saints of earlier eras. He had already canonized the author of the principal 16th century Catholic Catechism, Peter Canisius, and the revered 17th century theologian and spiritual author, Robert Bellarmine. He had declared them, along with the mystic John of the Cross, doctors of the Church as well. His successor, Pius XII, added to Albert's titles, patron of all who cultivate the natural sciences, in 1941.
So ultimately, the small amount of involvement with natural or ceremonial magic that Albert had was not seen as a barrier, but we can discuss this more in the future.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we go?
I'd just like to say thanks again to Dr. Justin Sledge for allowing us to use his presentation on St. Albert the Great here on Mysterious World. I plan to do future episodes covering aspects of Albert the Great's thought and work, but this one provided us with a great introduction to the mysterious side of them, so thanks, Justin, and I look forward to the next time you're on the show. Also, if you, the listener, are a Mysterious World fan, be sure and check out Justin's Esoterica channel on YouTube, where he goes in depth on many of the kinds of esoteric subjects that we cover on Mysterious World.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the viewers and listeners?
We'll have links to Justin's Esoterica channel, also his original video on Albert the Great, link to David Collins's book, Disenchanting Albert the Great, also a book of selected writings from Albert and Thomas, a translation of Women's Secrets, attributed to Pseudo-Albertus, also Albertus Magnus and the World of Nature, a few additional books, some of them in Latin, also an English translation of Albert the Great's book on minerals, and information about him from the Catholic Encyclopedia.
Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. This feedback comes from episode number 383, Interview, Grimoires and the Occult. Our first feedback comes from Aaron King 9332 on YouTube, who writes, Jimmy and friends, wouldn't a good angel possession be impossible because a good angel wouldn't infringe on someone's free will? Even if the person agrees to the initial possession, wouldn't being controlled like that afterward be against an unfallen angelic nature?
Okay, so the instance that I'm aware of that involves an ostensible possession by a good angel involved a nun known as Miriam, the Little Arab. And she lived a little more than 100 years ago. I'm currently reading a biography of hers, and I haven't yet got up to the part where the angelic possession is reported. But apparently, at least from some advanced, reading I've done about her situation, she had undergone a demonic possession, and then at the end of that, she was allowed to be possessed by a good angel as kind of comfort or consolation. And so in terms of evaluating that report, you say, wouldn't a good angel possession be impossible because the good angel would infringe on someone's free will? Well, if the person is themselves good, then yeah, and I wouldn't find infringing on that person's free will to be something that a good angel would do. On the other hand, I could see, since demons have the fundamental capacity to overwhelm a human's will and take possession of them, at least temporarily, good angels must have the same fundamental capacity. The question is, would they ever use it? Well, let's change the scenario. Let's suppose the human is a bad person. And they're about to kill an innocent human being. Could a good angel seize control of the bad person in this to stop them from killing the bad human being? Well, I would think that's consistent with what good angels could do. The good angel could, even terminate the life of the bad human in order to save the good human. So I would think that a good angel could do something less than killing the bad human. They could temporarily possess them to stop them from committing this horrible atrocity. So I would think there could be situations in which good angels could possess somebody, morally speaking, even though it means temporarily overwhelming that person's free will, which killing them also will do. You're preventing them from doing what they want. You then posit another scenario where you say, even if the person agrees to the initial possession, wouldn't being controlled like that afterward be against an unfallen angelic nature? Well, if the person consented to the possession, as I would assume Miriam did, then I don't see what the issue is. we have ecstatic states reported where people's, operation of free will is suspended, and they, may voluntarily enter this ecstatic state where they are not in full control of themselves, and they could surrender control to a good agent like a good angel, or they could surrender control of themselves to the Holy Spirit. In fact, St. Paul, talks about that in his letters. He says, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. And this is commonly interpreted by biblical scholars as, endorsing ecstatic states where the Holy Spirit is the animating principle that is, controlling a person, and they may be prophesying, or they may be speaking in tongues, or they may be doing something else. But if God himself can serve as a dominant influence in someone who is consented to an encounter of this nature, then it seems to me that if God can do it, his good servants, the angels, could also do it if the person is consenting. So I wouldn't rule it out in principle. I know that angelic possession is not common, but it is reported, and it might be allowed for, like in the case of Mariam, the little Arab, comfort and consolation in the wake of something like a demonic possession. So I can't rule it out that it happens.
All right. Our next feedback comes from Donald Boomer 6313 on YouTube, who writes, Jimmy says it's okay to use Christian spells to become a better singer.
Okay, stop.
Yep.
I have never said it is okay to use Christian spells, which Donald Boomer has put in quotation marks, indicating that, and it's ambiguous what he means by that, but one possible meaning is that I use the term Christian spells. I have never said this, and so we're already on shaky ground, but go ahead and read the rest of what he has to say.
Okay. So I'm worried he has been taken in by the New Age thinking, which is prevalent in paranormal groups and ghost hunting groups he may be associating with. I've heard long ago the same arguments he uses to justify some of his activities. Curiosity killed the cat, and we have to know when to stop, especially when influencing other more curious or gullible people. Okay,
so I don't have a problem interacting with people who take dissenting points of view. That's a regular part of the feedback segments, and I think that's healthy and constructive. What is not healthy and constructive, and what I'm frankly sick and tired of, is people misrepresenting things that I've said, because I'm very careful about what I say, and I see a lot of people, and Donald Boomer 6313 is doing this here, omitting all of the qualifiers in things I say and represented me as saying something that I have in fact never said. I have never said it is okay to use Christian spells to become a better singer. Also, I've never been involved. I'm not involved in any ghost hunting groups. I've never been involved in a ghost hunting group, and I've never been on a ghost hunt. So this is just speculation on Donald Boomer 6313's part, and it's baseless speculation. And frankly, I don't appreciate it. Now, what he's referring to, and what is a part of the interview where I pointed out that some things that are sometimes by some authors identified as spells are not actually problematic in content. And to illustrate that, I read from a book that was called by its authors Christian Magic, and it contained various rituals that we've unearthed in Egypt. And so these are like early Coptic Christian rituals, and they did include a ritual for trying to get a better singing voice. And so I read from the text of this ritual, and it's basically a prayer to God. It's just asking, it invokes the Trinity and the persons of the Trinity explicitly, and it says basically, please let me have a better singing voice that will please people that I sing for. And there also was a physical component of the ritual where you basically made a kind of drink out of honey and you drank it. Okay, well, I pointed out that the difference between a spell and a ritual is authorization, because magic is basically an unauthorized ritual, usually of shady or foreign origin. And I said, I have no idea what the ancient bishops in Egypt at the time this ritual was composed thought about it. They might have thought about it as, yeah, it's perfectly fine to do that. They may have authorized this ritual, this prayer, in which case it wouldn't be a spell. But I do not recommend that Christians use unauthorized rituals, whether to become a better singer or for other purposes. The church has rituals they can use. Among them are things like the St. Blaise blessing, which I also quoted in the same interview. I actually quoted the words of it, which also involves a divine invocation that specifically invokes St. Blaise. And there's also a physical component to that, where you take candles and cross them and apply them to the person's throat. So in both cases, you have a ritual with a prayer component, and there's nothing wrong in the prayer, and a physical component that is applied to the person's throat, either drinking a honeyed drink or applying crossed candles to the person's throat. So there's nothing wrong in principle with asking God to give you a better singing voice or to cure you of some other throat problem. There's no problem in principle with having a physical component to this. What's key is this authorized? And so if it's authorized, it is not a spell. It is just a blessing. And so I have no problem with people using Christian blessings that are properly authorized by ecclesial authority to become better singers. But I have never said, oh yeah, haul off and use Christian spells, whatever those are. I, in fact, have warned people, and in fact, I warned people in the interview about doing rituals that contain problematic material. But merely invoking God and asking him to give you a singing voice that's good is not a problem. That's just a prayer. So Donald Boomer 6313 has fundamentally misrepresented what I actually said, and frankly, I don't appreciate it. A big part of what Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is about is thinking through possibilities with precision. And if you're going to interact with what I do on the show, you need to respect the material and use similar precision. So I am frankly tired of people hauling off and saying things, attributing to me things that I've actually never said. So don't.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for your feedback. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Albert the Great and the mysterious side of his work? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or by calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me out. We've got over 100,000 subscribers, finally, and now we're working our way towards 200,000. And I'd love to have you as one of our subscribers. So like, comment, share the podcast with others, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video, because I have new videos coming out all the time.
I also want to thank Anna Fontaine for her voiceover work on this episode. And Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be looking at the JFK assassination and the role that the CIA may have played in it. In particular, we're going to be looking at the sworn testimony that was given at a trial in the 1980s about this matter. So one thing is sure, one way or another, if the CIA was or wasn't involved in the Kennedy assassination, someone is committing the crime of perjury.
All right. Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast from. Help us grow this community and reach even more listeners and viewers. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/390. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.